1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18. While you're turning there, last time we saw another look at civil order, how our lives help to silence criticism that's aimed at Christianity by how we live in the world, and that also helps us share the gospel when we live that way. But we saw the command to submit and the motive to submit, and then last time we saw the extent of our submission, and that's to every ordinance of man. Every ordinance that doesn't violate God's laws anyway. That means every level of government, every level of civil authority. Nothing is excluded from that, even the rules at the library or whatever that is. Just every ordinance of man. And it doesn't matter if the people in the places of authority, it doesn't matter if they're good or bad. God has placed them in those positions by His sovereign design, and we are to submit willingly to them as long as they don't violate God's laws. And so, why is that important? Well, it's the will of God, first of all, and it silences criticism from the ungodly. Our attitude, if we're truly free in Christ, then we wouldn't use our liberty as a means to commit sin and violate those rules. And so Peter summed it up there in verse 17 last time: honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And we're going to continue that this evening. These are all about a willing submission through this section here this evening, and Lord willing next week. It was going to be too long, so I broke it down into a couple lessons. But this is about submission in the workplace, at jobs. And I know some of you are retired, but that doesn't exclude you, because sometimes people work for us, do odd jobs or whatever that is. Sometimes we do things for other people. And so this applies. Doesn't matter if you're retired or a homemaker, it still applies to us. 1 Peter 2, 18 through 21 says, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it, if when ye be buffeted for your faults, ye shall take it patiently? But if, when ye do well and suffer for it, ye take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow His steps. Now, we understand civil rights and those type of things. That's a hot topic in our society. It just, the names change. It's a different group, seems like, from time to time, but it's some kind of, whether sometimes it's a minority group, sometimes it's an ethnic group or a racial group or a religious group or a different sexual orientation, whatever it is. Somebody feels like they deserve more than what they're getting, and they're causing problems about that and trying to demand what they think is their right, what they're entitled to. And some of those things we're not going to say are not legitimate causes, because they are. We understand sometimes people are mistreated. They're not treated fairly, and we understand that. But other times when people are wanting something to change, a lot of times it's just about greed. They always give a survey for us. I don't know if you guys fill out that postal survey or not, but they give us a survey, and it says, every time it says, are you satisfied with your wages or compensation or something like that at the postal service? And it's a psychological kind of thing, and depending on how you answer certain questions, well, then they'll put weight on the other questions. And if you say, well, I'm not happy with how I get paid, then they don't credit other questions quite the same. They say, oh, well, you're already disgruntled, you think you don't get paid enough, and you know it's a game. So I don't actually fill that out, but but a person who says, I am satisfied with my wages, well, then they use that and say, well, then you don't really need more, so we're not going to give you any more. And so, they play that kind of against each other when they do those kind of things. But we see that all the time, where a group will picket. Now, we can't picket at the post office, praise the Lord for that. Can't strike, can't do that. I like working, so I don't want to picket and strike and do those kind of things. But some groups do, and they're trying to force change. We'll see this evening, Lord willing, and next time, that's not God's way to deal with those kind of things. And so for Christians, sometimes when we do things the world's way, we get the change that we want, but we sacrifice something for God in that process. And so it's only a temporary gain. You know, if I get a raise at my job because I stood out there and shook a sign and you know, griped and complained and got people to blow their horn on the highway and shut down the business or whatever that is, if I get that, how long does that actually last? Well, it may last as long as I'm working, but I can't take any of that extra money to heaven with me, can I? No. And so, but I may sacrifice something very valuable in the process to gain that, something, an opportunity maybe that would have had eternal consequences, a chance to witness to somebody, and we'll see some more of that as we go along. But God kind of simplifies this here in verse 18. He says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." Now look over in 1 Samuel chapter 16. We just started in 1 Samuel. I don't know that we won't continue in 1 Samuel. As far as I know, that's the direction we will continue to go on Sunday mornings. But on Sunday mornings, we're just now at the beginning of Samuel's life, and he's a young child. But if you fast forward a little bit to 1 Samuel chapter 16, you can see some of this submission to a master or a person in authority over you through the life of David. And Samuel's involved with that. But 1 Samuel 16:1 says, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons." Now we know who that son is. It's David. But Samuel was involved with the anointing of the first king of Israel, which was Saul. But Saul has now been rejected by God because of his disobedience. And more specifically, you remember Samuel was delayed, if you know that account. Samuel was supposed to meet up with King Saul there, and he's late getting to him. And Saul feels like he has to offer the sacrifice. They have to offer the sacrifice for the people before they go to battle and do those kind of things. And so Saul says, "I forced myself. I didn't want to, but you were late coming," and he goes ahead and kills the sacrifice. He is not a priest. He wasn't allowed to do that. There were other priests besides Samuel. Somebody else could have done that, but he was waiting on Samuel. Samuel didn't come, and he went ahead and did that. But because of that, God actually removed the kingdom from him. It wouldn't pass to his son Jonathan. It wouldn't continue in his family line. And so Samuel's grieving over that there in 1 Samuel 16:1. He's grieving because God has now rejected Saul. There's nothing wrong with that, except that Samuel's grieving has become excessive. Now, there is something wrong with excessive grieving. Excessive grieving either means that we've rejected God's decision. God has allowed something to happen in our lives, and we refuse to believe that in God's sovereign plan that's best. And so we've either rejected that decision, or God's trying to comfort us, because God is the God of all comfort. God's trying to comfort us, but we're refusing to be comforted. And so it's one of those two things. When people grieve and grieve and grieve, you probably know people like that grieve themselves to death. They lost a spouse. There was nothing physically wrong with them at that time, and in a short period of time they just died. And they just grieved themselves to death, and that's not what God would have us to do. And so that's where Samuel's at. And it's not even his family. It's just Saul. It's the king. But he had an attachment to him and felt for him there. But God sends Samuel to Jesse's family, and he's going to anoint the next king. If you look down to 1 Samuel 16, verse 11 through 14, it says, And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? You remember he starts bringing the sons by there, and they start from the oldest and the biggest and all that, and they get down to the end. He says, God, it's not one of these, and he asked Jesse, is this all thy children? And there, verse 11 again, and he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and with all of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So the first king of Israel, which was Saul, that's the kind of king that the people wanted. When you see Saul and the description of Saul, we won't read those verses there, but Saul is a great, big, strong man. That expression, head and shoulders above the rest, that's what he was, literally that much taller than every other person, which ironically would have made him the closest match to Goliath, even though he refused to face him in the battle with the Philistines there. But it also, he was a person of good moral character along with that. And so when we use that expression, head and shoulders above the rest, we're either talking about somebody who's physically superior, athletically, or something like that, or they're that much better morally than others. And so that's where that expression came from. So that's what Saul was. He was a good moral person initially. But that didn't continue. Now the next king, the second king, David, is the kind of king that God wanted. Not the kind that the people wanted. He's not this great, big, huge, strong specimen of a person. He's got inner strength, but David is the kind of person that would depend on God for his strength, not on his own ability. And he would allow God to lead him and seek God with his whole heart. That's the kind of king that David is going to be. Now, that doesn't mean David's perfect, but he does rely on God much more than Saul did throughout his lifetime, especially in the end. And so here in these verses here in 1 Samuel 16, David has just been anointed king of Israel. Right? He doesn't actually become king for quite some time. It's about 15 years later before he actually assumes the throne. So, normally if you anoint somebody, or kind of like today, if you swear somebody into an office or something, it's right then. That's when they kind of take over. They assume the position, whatever that is. And now Samuel has anointed David, but David doesn't actually become king yet. He has the right to it, the throne, by God's design, but he doesn't actually take that. Instead, he continues to submit to the authority that God has placed over him, which is still the first king. God hasn't removed Saul yet from the throne. And so David just keeps submitting to him. In 1 Samuel 19, Saul, don't turn there. Go to 1 Samuel 24. That's where the verses are going to read. But just for reference there, 1 Samuel 19, Saul at that point, you remember, he keeps taking shots at David there and throws a javelin at him, things like that, But in 1 Samuel 19, Saul openly reveals to his son Jonathan and to his servants that they are to kill David. If they get a chance, kill him. And that's when David becomes a fugitive. He's running for his life for at least a year and a half. Now you look over to 1 Samuel 24, 2-4. This is in the middle of that time when Saul is chasing him all over the countryside trying to find him. David's got a group of men with him, but it's nothing compared to Saul's army. In 1 Samuel 24, 2-4, he says, Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. Now, David had a chance to kill Saul in the cave there, didn't he? I mean, he goes in there, he takes him a little nap, so he cuts off the bottom of his robe. He's close enough to do him bodily harm. His own men were encouraging him to do that. Just go ahead and kill this guy. Go ahead and take the throne. It's supposed to be yours anyway. He's already been anointed, and you remember he cuts off the part of Saul's robe, which later he bothers him. He repents of that. He's sorry that he even did that. But there in 1 Samuel 24:6, he says, And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. And so, even though the throne is rightfully his, he wouldn't take it through sinful means. He wouldn't murder this person, even though that's exactly what Saul is trying to do to him. He's not going to return that recompense. Now, 1 Samuel 24:12 says, The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. Now, when God removes Saul from the throne, then David will occupy it. But David says, I'm not going to speed that process up. I'm not going to take that into my own hands. I'm not going to try to take your life myself. In 1 Samuel 26, look over a couple chapters. 1 Samuel 26 and verse 8, David gets another chance to kill Saul. And in this instance, he and Abishai, they sneak into the camp of Saul at night. And when they get there, Saul and his men are all asleep there. And his spear is stuck in the ground beside him. Now, spears had the metal end on one end that was the killing end. The other end is wood, but it's sharpened to a point. So basically, they could stick it in the ground somewhere, and when they needed to fight, they could just pull it up and use the sharp end. That's how those things work. So it's just stuck in the ground, ready for them to pick up and use at any time. But they're all sleeping. 1 Samuel 26:8 says, Then said Abishai to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore let me smite him, I pray thee, with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. Abishai says, just give me one shot at it. Just one shot. I'll take that spear right there by him, and I'll end this right here with one stroke. I won't need two. Right? And so he's a trained killer. Here's David's response. 1 Samuel 26:9-11. And David said to Abishai, Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, Furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I shall stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed. But I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go. And so, David says either God's going to kill him, he's going to die of natural causes, just old age, right? Or he's going to die in battle against an enemy. One of those three things is going to happen. David says the one thing that's not going to happen is I'm not going to kill him. And I'm not going to let my men kill him. We're not going to do it that way. We can't be guiltless if we do it that way. And so he's submitting to that authority, even though Saul is not doing the right thing at that time by chasing David. Now look over at Romans chapter 12. We'll get a little closer to where we started from. Romans chapter 12, verse 17. We'll know these end verses for sure. Romans 12:17-19. He says, Recompense to no man evil for evil. provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And so David understood that. We're not to take our own vengeance, even if we think we have the right to. Right? We don't do that. There. And Jesus, in Luke chapter 6, if you back up a little bit, Jesus gives the same principle that Peter's sharing here in our original text in Luke 6. In verse 31, beginning there, he says, Luke 6:31, And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. Now, it doesn't matter what they've done to us. What's he say? What would you want them to do to you? That's what we're supposed to do. It doesn't matter what their part was. It doesn't matter what they did ahead of time. It doesn't matter what they'll do afterward. Luke 6 there, 32 through 34, he says, For if you love them which love you, what thank have ye? For sinners also love those that love them. And if you do good to them which do good to you, what thank have ye? For sinners also do even the same. And if you lend to them of whom ye hope to receive, what thank have ye? For sinners also lend to sinners to receive as much again. And so, people return what they're given. If somebody shows love to someone, they'll show love back. If somebody shows goodness or generosity, others will show that back. It's a repayment of a favor there. Same thing if somebody lent money and they paid it back, they would lend to you and return that. And he says that's not uncommon. Unsaved people do that. That doesn't make anything special. But the next command from Jesus does set us apart from the world. There in Luke 6:35, he says, But love ye your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. And Jesus says, if you can do those things for your enemy, someone who wouldn't do that in return, someone who wouldn't even be thankful for that, he says, if you can do it for them, then you can show God to them. Because that's different from anybody else in the world. Now, Peter is writing to Christians. Look over 1 Corinthians 7. Peter's writing to Christians scattered in the Roman Empire. Most of them can't change their social status, even if they wanted to. They can't change it. And we've studied this recently about Paul's commands regarding these things in 1 Corinthians 7:20 through 22. And you'll remember this when we talk about it. He says, Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also that he is called, being free, is Christ's servant. And you can read the rest of those verses around that. You remember what Paul said. Some of them were married. Some of them were single. Some of them were slaves. Some of them were free. Some of them were slaves that were set free. And Paul kept saying the same thing. Don't worry about that part. That doesn't matter. If you're a single person, serve God as a single person. If you're a married person, serve God as a married person. If you're a slave, serve as a slave. If you're a free person, serve as a free person. Don't worry about the change in the social status. It's not going to make us better for God. The circumstances don't hinder our ability to minister for God. You remember when Paul was ministering, of course he's going around starting churches and those kind of things on his missionary journeys, but Paul's ministry didn't even slow down when he got arrested and spent all that time in prison there in and around Jerusalem and in Rome. And all it did was change who he could minister to. Even when he's under house arrest, he's still ministering. The people just have to come to him. It's the soldiers he's ministering to. It's the people in Caesar's household that he's ministering to. So he gets opportunities to minister to different people that he never had a chance to before. And so, the key is obedience to God is what benefits our ability to minister for God. Disobedience is what hinders it. That's what slows it down. So back in 1 Peter 2, verse 18, he says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." Now, the dominant social class in the Roman Empire when Peter writes this letter is slaves. There are more slaves than any other group in the empire. Now, slaves are a result of conquest. The Romans conquered different groups. Those people became slaves. Now, eventually, the Roman Empire just dissolves. It just goes away. It just ceases to exist. It's not conquered like the other empires before it. All the major empires of the world before that, somebody else came along and took over. That doesn't happen with the Roman Empire. Basically, what happens with the Roman Empire is Rome lost people to conquer. There's not enough people left to take over. There's not other nations that they can conquer. And so what happens is they're not adding slaves to the kingdom. As an act of generosity to try to appease the people along the way, the different Caesars would grant citizenship to certain groups, to certain cities there. When he grants citizenship to some, they no longer are slaves. What happens is exactly what's happening in America today. You have less and less people to work, and more people who think they don't need to work. And so that's what happened in the Roman Empire. There are more and more free people in the empire who felt like the slaves should do the work. But when you're not adding slaves to the empire, what happens? You've got less and less people to do the work, and more people who think they should benefit from it, and eventually the whole thing just collapses. I think that's what will happen in America. It's not a prophecy from God. That's just kind of my prediction. I don't know. It's as good as anybody else's, but it's heading that direction. Eventually I don't think we'll have Social Security for people because there won't be enough people working and paying into it to support all the people that are taken out of it. Or they'll have to either drop the benefits or do something along the way. But at this time, slaves are the dominant group, and they've been conquered, and so prisoners of war became slaves, and that's how most people became a part of the Roman Empire. Now, this is about the requirement of submission through work, but it's going to be directed primarily at the slaves because most of them fit that description when Paul writes this. And now some of those slaves were treated well. They were treated well. They were loved by their masters, and some of them even became like family to them. We see that even in Old Testament times there. Others, they weren't treated so kindly, and some of them were even abused by their owners or masters there. But no matter how well they were treated as a slave or how poorly they were treated, most in the Roman Empire considered slaves to be property more so than people. They're considered property. Right? Slaves didn't have legal rights like free citizens did. Aristotle wrote this. Most of you know about Aristotle. Aristotle wrote this: "There can be no friendship or justice toward an inanimate thing. Not a horse, not an ox, not a slave." So, what he was saying is, they couldn't be treated like humans. They're like an inanimate thing, no different than a horse or an ox. That's how they treated them, and that they're different from regular people is what he was saying there. The Romans also had 3 classes of farm equipment, and one class they called the mute. Mutes are things that can't talk. That class of farm equipment would be things like plows and sickles and things like that. They're not alive. Another class was inarticulate. Now that's things that can talk or make noise. My cat can meow and make noises and that kind of stuff, but she's inarticulate. We can't understand none of the nonsense she does. Same thing with our dog. Our dog can bark incessantly, and we don't know what she's trying to say. It's inarticulate. And so that was another group of farm equipment, and that would include things like oxen and horses and those kind of things. And so, you've got the mute things, the tools, what we call them, plows and those type of things. You've got the inarticulate things. The third group of farm equipment was the articulate. That's things that could talk, and they could understand them. That was the slaves. They were treated like a class of farm equipment, just like plows, just like horses or oxen, just like slaves, just a different kind. And so, that's how they treated them. Now, if I were to ask most people this question, can all people have equal rights in a society? If you ask that question to most people, can everybody have equal rights in a society? What would your average person say? Well, sure, everybody should have equal rights. Now, is that true? No, it's not true. It sounds good. It may even look good on paper. Let me ask you this. Can children have equal rights with their parents? Can a child make its own decisions about what kind of food that it would eat, when and what time it can go to bed, those kind of things? Could a child have equal rights with the parents and the society still function properly? No, that's impossible. Well, what about we move to adults? Can all adults have equal rights? The answer, still no. Not for a society to function. Here's how we know this. I got pretty tickled yesterday. I was telling Sheila and them on the way to work. I usually don't pay no attention to gas prices. I just buy gas. I got to have it. So, it's basically going green up. It's basically all the same. They're a penny difference or something like that. And I come by the other day and I just happened to see Marathon was $3.29 and the other one down there was $3.29 and the BP was $3.29 and Super Quick $3.09. What? $3.09, that's 20 cents. I paid cash, I got another 6 cents. I paid $3.03 for gas. I saved like $1.50 or something on gas, But, if we had equal rights as customers with those who own businesses, would the businesses continue to exist? If I got to set the price on the things that I buy instead of the owner, could they be in business? Well, I'd say no. If they asked me what gas should be, I'd say $0.25 a gallon, maybe 10 cents. Right? Well, they can't make it that cheap. Right? So I can't have equal rights with the owners of those businesses, or they'll no longer be in business. There'll be no place to buy gas from. And so in order for a society to exist, that can't happen. Everybody can't have equal rights. That's a pipe dream. It can't function that way. And we understand that. 1 Peter 2:18 again, he says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward." Now, that's the same idea. It sounds good, but it can't function that way. Now, what's amazing is in the New Testament church, they don't much care about social class. In the early New Testament church, they don't have a lot of concern about that because they understand they're spiritual equals. In Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. That's spiritual equality. That's not the same as having the same roles. It's not the same as having the same functions. It's spiritual equality. And so in their minds, in the early New Testament church, you can see that right, by their lack of concern for social classes and stuff. When the early New Testament comes together and you've got all those people that are piling into Jerusalem for the feast day, Peter preaches Pentecost. Thousands of people start getting saved. The church is just exploding. There are all kinds of people being added. Those people weren't getting any of that sound teaching at their homes away from the area around Jerusalem. The apostles haven't spread out to that area. They haven't taken Jesus' teaching out there yet. So they've got no sound churches to go back to. And what happens? They want to stay there in and around Jerusalem. The problem of it is the Jews that didn't accept Christ resented the Christians. And so even though some of them were trying to find work there, they wouldn't hire them. And so they were struggling to survive. They wanted to stay there, keep getting the teaching from God's Word through the apostles there. But that's, remember, when the people, they start selling property and they just start pooling their money and they just bring it and said, just give it to whoever needs it. And the apostles distributed that as they saw fit. And they didn't see that as important, to have all this money that they didn't really use, or property that they weren't really using. Or Joe, I was tickled about getting calls about selling some property over on 207. And I said, well, tell them to send you the money, Joe. Everything's for sale. And he said, I don't own no property on 207. I said, well, even better. No, but they didn't really care about that. They didn't care if they had an excess. As long as they had enough to get by, that was fine for them. And that's that same kind of idea there. It's this idea, we spend so little time here on this earth, in this life. Our life is like a what? Vapor. Here for a little time and then vanisheth away. This life compared to eternity means nothing. It's almost insignificant. If it weren't for our getting our rewards for this little bit of service here, we'd say this doesn't mean anything as far as eternity is concerned. Right? It doesn't matter how much we collect here. We don't get any of that to take with us. Right? We lay up treasures in heaven other ways. It's not in financial ways. It's in service and faithfulness to God, those type of things. And so when Peter uses this word there in verse 18, servants. Now the normal word for servants or slaves would be doulos. That's the most common word for slaves. This is a more familiar word for them. It's not doulos. It's the same kind of idea. But this word is oikotes. Oikotes is a household slave. And the idea is most people, if you were a landowner of some sort, a free citizen in the Roman Empire, you had somebody, some kind of slave, serving you somehow in the household. Either around the house, in the fields, something. And so that's the most common phrase for them, a household slave. They just took care of menial tasks, whatever their master told them to do. And so, but the command here is to submit not just to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. The froward are the crooked, the perverse, the unreasonable ones. Right? Most people have, if you've had more than one job probably, or more than one boss, the boss changes from time to time. Sometimes you get some good ones. Sometimes you get some that are a little unreasonable. Right? Sometimes they're even crooked, or perverse, or corrupt, or whatever other word you want to use for that. Most Christians would probably rather that last part of that verse not be there. Right? It's okay for us to submit to the good and gentle, but we don't really want to do it to the crooked or the unreasonable or the corrupt ones. Right? But that's not what God says. The good and gentle master would be a person who's fair with these servants and generous with them. Even that's somebody that anybody would want to work for, but that's how we're supposed to treat others. If we employ other people, we're supposed to be kind and generous and all those type of things there, best that we can. But the other one there, the froward, that person is not a fair person. They're crooked and unbending, unreasonable, and that's the kind of person nobody would choose to work for. If they had a chance, they'd much rather have the other one. Right? And so, but God allows those people to hold those positions at times. The crooked, the perverse, the froward there. And so in our society, we could just go get another job. If you got a job like that and you got a boss and you're stuck with somebody like that and they're horrible to you and they treat you awful and they don't pay you good and they're just unreasonable and those type of things, we can go down the road and get another job, but maybe a better job and a better boss. But in the society where Peter's writing to, most of their jobs is slavery. Now, slavery, you can't go get another job. They can't leave their master. If they leave their master, that's a criminal offense. Runaway slaves, how did they punish runaway slaves in the Roman Empire? They killed them. That was punishable by death. It could be, didn't have to be, but it could be. The whole book of Philemon, if you know about the book of Philemon, that's about a runaway slave by the name of Onesimus. And Onesimus meets up with Paul in Rome. He's a long way away from where Philemon is. But he meets up with Paul there and he gets saved. And Paul says, you are this person's slave. He's your master. You have to go back. And he writes this letter encouraging Philemon to do just that, to accept him back and not have him put to death. That's what the letter is about. And he goes back and he says, you need to willingly submit to your master. Yes, you're free in Christ, but you're not free from that obligation in that position there. And just like we saw with the life of David, God will deal with the unjust. He'll deal with the cruel. He'll deal with the unreasonable, the perverse, the corrupt. He'll do it in His timing. No, we don't have to rebel against that. We don't have to try to force that on our own. And so God does condemn the oppression of servants or slaves multiple times in Scripture, but not the idea of it. Because the idea transfers over into our society as work. Employee-employer relationship. Everybody's a slave to the master. If you have bills, you have to work. Unless you've saved up, retirement, those kind of things, you still got to have bills. You still got to pay those things. But Ephesians 6 and verse 5, a few verses over there, and then we'll go on to Peter. But first, Ephesians 6 verse 5 says, servants or slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Now our work for them, as we talked about before, is to be done as unto Christ, like Jesus was our boss, not whoever that person filling the position is. Verse 6, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And so we shouldn't just look like we're doing a good job. We should actually be doing that wholeheartedly, doing the best that we can. Verse 7, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men. And so he repeats the same idea. It's to the Lord, not to men. Now back in 1 Peter 2 verse 19, Peter says this, for this is thankworthy if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. And so that kind of submission in the workplace finds favor with God. Just submitting to whatever your boss tells you to do. That doesn't mean you can't question things in the right way, with the right attitude, not rebellious, those kind of things. I remember when Don and I moved to South Carolina to go to school, we needed money to live on. We managed to get a trailer and get it set up down there, but we had to pay the bills there. We had to support ourselves and get our own food and pay our utilities and those kind of things, and still be able to have time to go to school and study and church on Wednesdays and Sundays. And God provided that. We had some neighbors in our trailer park there, and they knew a man that was looking for workers. He owned a waterproofing company there, and this guy, he had expressed a need for some workers, and so they hooked us up together, and he paid us $6 an hour. $6 an hour. We were jumping up and down. That was $1 more than my dad paid me when I left home. I thought, yeah, I've hit the big time, right? that was also, the minimum wage was somewhere around $3 then. So that was almost double what you could get working at McDonald's or Walmart or someplace like that. And so, that really worked out for us because we could make more money in a shorter period of time. But that was hard work and dirty work, and a lot of that was, we'd go around, they'd be building new houses or something like that, and they'd have a crawl space or a basement or something, and when they'd lay the block, that mortar and stuff, they'd just slop it down on the footer. Well, to get that sealed up and waterproofed right, that's got to come off. That can't stay on that concrete footer, and so we'd take mattocks and stuff and shovels and chip that off and clean it all off real good, and then we'd dig ditches for a French drain around the outside, and we'd haul gravel in buckets or wheelbarrows and cover the pipe and do those kind of stuff. We didn't do a whole lot of waterproofing sometimes because my boss had 2 crews, a full-time crew that would come in, put the waterproofing on, do those kind of things. And so what it ended up was, me and Don were going there and we were doing the mattocking and the shoveling and the chipping and the cleaning and all that kind of stuff. And then we'd go to another job and do the same thing. That group would come in behind us, put the waterproofing on. We'd come back the next day, dig the ditch for the pipe, put the gravel in, do those kind of stuff, and they'd fill it in. Right? And so we were doing the harder work, but it was supplying our needs. And so we left school for the summer, came back home, tried to pile up as much money as we could, shut the utilities off in our trailer down there, and saved as much money as we could. We came back the next year to go to work, and he said, we'd have a job waiting when we came back. And so we came back to work, and we get our first paycheck, and it's $1 more an hour. $7 an hour. And we did that the next year, came back the next year, it's $1 more. He did that every year we were there. Now, I never asked for a raise from my boss. Don didn't ask for a raise. But God worked that out. We were just trying to be submissive to whatever our boss told us to do, and and he was paying us well for it, and God was rewarding us. But we may be doing a job well, but if we have a poor attitude while we're doing that job, that's not this kind of submission that Peter's writing about. Or if we have a good attitude, but we're not really doing the job well, that's the same thing. It's still not the right kind of submission. God will reward us in due time. You don't have to be rebellious. You don't have to be loud. We don't have to walk a picket line. We don't have to do those things to get what we think we deserve. God's still in control. God's working out those details, and He'll work them out if we let Him. If we let Him, right? And we can go the world's route, and we can get the change that way, right? But we may lose a chance to witness. Right? You may walk the picket line and lose your job. I've known people to do that too. The company just say, we're done, and shut down. They lost their job and everything. But the world's way doesn't silence criticism. The world's way doesn't allow us to be the best witness that we can for God. And like I said, if we gain a big raise and we have that for a short period of time, but we lose our chance to witness to that person who was our boss or supervisor or somebody like that else in the company, we've lost something eternal to gain something temporary, and we don't want to do that. That's why God says there's a way to do it the right way, the willing submission to God. And so we'll see more of this next time, Lord willing. But any questions or comments this evening?